We've got a loaded final hour. We are joined now by Dr. David Chao at Pro Football Doc, as we typically are every single Thursday. He's at work getting ready for the return of the NFL. Dr. Chao, appreciate you being up early with us, especially on the West Coast. And we got a game tonight that's actually a pretty interesting one in Thursday Night Football. I'm going to go watch it in person. Colts on the road against the Titans, battle for the AFC South crown. Where are we from an injury perspective from these two teams?
Really, these are two of the more healthier teams, and it's good for both sides. For the Colts, what they have going for them is their entire offensive line is healthy, and T.Y. Hilton is back. And on defense, Malik Hooker's obviously been out all year. For the Titans, their left tackle's out with an ACL. Adam Humphries won't clear the concussion protocol. And Jadeveon Clowney on defense will play, but not necessarily be 100% with his meniscus tear.
So overall, health-wise, would you assess the Colts or the Titans to be in better health-related conditions, or is health likely to be very substantial of a factor here?
Well, this isn't one of the more glaring games of health inequities, but the Colts are slightly healthier than the Titans if you look at it overall.
Good deal. Where else are we looking at major health-related concerns as we move into the weekend?
Well, the 49ers have taken over the mantle as the most injured team in the league, and everyone focuses on their fantasy players on offense. Jimmy G, Kittle, et cetera, Deebo Samuel, the running backs. But the reality is their defense has been banged up for quite a while. They've got 4 defensive linemen on injured reserve that would make a great starting front four for any team, from Nick Bosa to Dee Ford to Ezekiel Ansah to Solomon Thomas. And so they're banged up more than the Eagles. The Eagles have had the mantle of the most banged up team, but they're actually headed in the right direction coming off the bye. Alshon Jeffrey will actually make his season debut finally. Miles Sanders, I believe, will be good to go from his knee sprain from a couple weeks ago. And Lane Johnson, I think, will actually finish a game this week at right tackle. So the Eagles are actually headed in the right direction.
What do we need to know about the Ben Roethlisbergers of the world that are being contact traced in some way? How is the NFL applying the rule in situations such as Roethlisberger? We tend to pay more attention to it when it involves a quarterback, but what exactly is going on here?
Well, I actually defined all the rules and the definitions for all the terms: close contact, high risk, asymptomatic positive, symptomatic positive, et cetera, at Outkick on the Pro Football Doc podcast. And close contacts can return to practice and contact with the team basically the next day immediately. They're just put on hold for an investigation. If you're determined to be high risk, that requires a mandatory 5-day quarantining, but it's 5 days from your high-risk contact, not 5 days from the media reporting that you're
right
on the list. And so this is why, and part of that hasn't been fully defined, but Dr. Sills of the NFL, who's done a good job, has said that part of it is if you're within 6 feet of someone and not wearing a mask. If you're within 6 feet, I think you become close contact with it for 15 minutes. But if you're not wearing a mask within 6 feet, that's when you become high risk. And if you notice on the sidelines, a lot more players are wearing masks to try and avoid that high risk designation. And also the sidelines used to be from the 32 to the 32, and now it's from the 20 to the 20. So they've widened the sidelines and understood that to date, in all of documented professional sports, not just football, not just college football, there has yet to be, in professional leagues anyways, rugby, soccer, across the world, of a cross-team transmission, in other words, to an opponent
yes
on the playing field. That hasn't been documented. I'm not saying it's impossible. It just hasn't been documented yet. And so Big Ben, getting back to it, this COVID high-risk designation actually doesn't affect him at all because he wasn't going to practice this entire week anyways with his left knee MCL sprain. He was going to play, and it's the same with this COVID in this case. He's not going to practice, and he's going to play with that knee issue. So even though the line opened at Steelers -10, and with Big Ben's injury news went to 7, 6, right now FanDuel 6.5, that line's going to go back up once it's determined that he's good to go for Sunday.
It's first of all, I want to give you a lot of props here because what you just said, I think, is a big deal. Dr. Sills, who is the NFL's chief medical examiner, didn't just say there hasn't been a single case of cross-team transmission in football play. He said in any sport in the world that they have been able to prove that one guy who was infected on one team got somebody on the opposing team sick during the course of a game, right? That's a pretty significant factor. And you, months ago, said that you thought it was likely, based on the analogy that you used, which I thought was a good one, a lot of people understood, it was use your sunburn analogy, right? That mere exposure. And you said the same thing when that picture went viral of Stephon Gilmore talking to Patrick Mahomes, and everybody was like, oh my God, we got a major issue here. Those are transitory, limited contacts. So the amount of viral load, as I believe you put it, that was likely to be distributed in those interactions was low, making the risk of infection low. It takes sustained exposure in order typically to have an infection pass.
That's correct. In that viral load article was actually, I think, one of the first articles I wrote for Outkick, and It was well before the football season. And the analogy, and it's simply this: one coronavirus is not going to give you COVID. It takes hundreds, if not thousands. One strong ray of the sun is not going to get you sunburn. And I'm not trying to equate being sunburned with getting COVID.
Understood.
But you get the analogy of
exposure
of how
risk.
It's exposure.
To your point, like if you walk out to the beach, most people listening to us right now have been to the beach or they've been to a lake somewhere where you're out in the sun. If you're out in the sun for 5 minutes, unless you're super, super susceptible to sunburn, you're probably not going to get sunburned. If you're out for 5 hours and you don't do anything, you may well get sunburned, right? Everybody's a little bit different, but the exposure to sunlight impacts whether or not you're impacted by that sunlight, much like the exposure to the virus, the length of time that you're exposed impacts the likelihood that you could be infected as well.
No question. And, is it high noon and the sun is strong and you're near the equator, or is it 5 p.m. at night and the sun's down low? Are you next to someone who's coughing, sneezing, and spewing hundreds, if not thousands, of coronavirus in every breath and yelling and singing? Or are you next to someone who's asymptomatic and speaking quietly? So all those things matter. And to clarify, I'm not suggesting that you go out and hug someone with coronavirus like Patrick Mahomes inadvertently did. And I'm not saying it is impossible to transmit COVID through sports play. What Dr. Sill said was what my information is. Last week or the week before, SI wrote an article saying that in college football, the medical experts have yet to document across the line of scrimmage transmission. In pro sports that the NFL has been in contact with, World Rugby Leagues, soccer leagues, Australia, Aussie rules, etc. In those sports situations that they have surveyed, they haven't seen it. I'm not saying, you couldn't have a wrestling match and not transmit COVID or anything like that. I'm just saying so far in those sports, in those professional examples, we haven't had a documented case yet.
We're talking to Dr. David Chao. Now, I know you focus a lot on the NFL with us and with your articles at Outkick and at your own website for sure in terms of health. But when you look at some of these situations in college football where, for instance, in Berkeley, they're not being allowed to play because of one positive test and they may lose a second straight game with Arizona State. We've got games being canceled, Maryland and Ohio State, several in the SEC. Do you think that the way that college football in particular is responding to COVID, do their policies make sense?
Well, the problem is it's not centralized, so they don't always make sense. And I can point out some examples. First of all, in medicine, I'm never a fan of being rigid. Always this, if this diagnosis, right? So always 14 days if you test positive. There's false positive, there's asymptomatic. The NFL lets people come back at 5 days for high risk, 10 days even if you test positive. There shouldn't necessarily be rigid rules. But on the other hand, sometimes there's too much freedom. I'd be very curious if you would ask the commissioner, with all due respect, everyone made a huge deal last weekend about Notre Dame fans storming the field.
Right.
No question that wasn't ideal. All right. But, and you can make the argument, what are these kids going to do that Saturday night anyways? And it'll be indoors at a party. But look, that's not ideal and you shouldn't have that. But I think the bigger question that I had was, why was Trevor Lawrence quarantined and not able to play, yet allowed to travel with the team and be on the sidelines, albeit with a mask, okay? But as we talk about, at the game is less dangerous than on the sidelines, in the locker room.
Right.
Like I pointed out, the Saints dancing in that small Tampa Bay locker room. And I wasn't criticizing the dancing. I was just saying, look at the background. Look at how close everyone is in the locker room. That's where the danger is. Buses, flights, etc. So my question, the bigger faux pas to me, or question mark, is why Trevor Lawrence was allowed to travel. Yes, it wasn't great that there were all those Notre Dame fans on the field, but to me, there's two parts to that.
There's a lot of illogic, right? When you actually break down many of these decisions that are being made, they don't rationally line up. And Trevor Lawrence is a great example. Now, the ACC said, well, he still has to wait to get some sort of heart condition test to be completely cleared. But to your point, he's on the road, he's on an airplane, he's at the team meals, he's on the sideline, he's interacting with his teammates. If he's not infectious anymore, how in the world can he be in a position? And here's the last question for you. It seems like, and I don't know if you've paid a lot of attention to this, but in college football, and I'm going to ask the commissioner about this, when someone tests positive, they can come back and play within 10 days once they have 3 negative tests, I believe. And so you might only miss 10 days if you test positive. But if you are a close contact in college football, you have to quarantine for 14 days. So it seems illogical to me that the person who is actually testing positive for the virus is able to be back playing before the person who has merely been exposed to the virus.
No question. And I wasn't implying that Greg Sankey did anything wrong.
No.
Yeah. I'm just saying he knows college football, right? And so that's kind of where the question was. And that's an interesting point. And medically, I think the justification, not saying that I agree with it completely, is that if you have a close contact, it could be 3 or 5 days before you turn positive. There's delays to turning positive. And then you add the 10 days to that. And how do we get to 14 days or 2 weeks? I mean, I'm not sure, right? That's just the calendar, the way that it works. So, yeah, there's a lot that we don't know, and there are a lot of different inconsistencies in terms of what's out there, because it is a novel situation. And with so many different conferences and governing bodies and schools with different policies, it's obviously makes it interesting to watch, and there are contradictions.
Dr. Chao, appreciate it, my man. Appreciate you being flexible with us. We'll talk to you next week.